Millionaire fakes being in a coma until he hears what the nurse whispers in his ear. No one suspected a thing. The motionless body on the bed seemed peaceful, almost serene, as if he just needed a little more time to open his eyes. The monitors showed stable vitals, the ventilator whispered its artificial breath, and the night shift staff walked past his room without paying much attention. To them, he was just another coma patient. Another one. But Alexander Whitmore was awake. He had known it from the moment he first opened his eyes, hours after the accident. He felt the weight of his body, the sharp pain in his ribs, the stiffness in his neck, and instinct. That visceral instinct telling him he shouldn't move. Not yet. Not now. He had learned to distrust the world, and even more so those around him. His father's lawyers, former business partners, even his older brother. Too many interested glances, too many outstretched hands with hidden conditions. So when he overheard doctors discussing his induced coma, he saw in that confusion an opportunity he couldn't waste. Who would visit him believing he couldn't hear? Who would speak without filters, without masks, in front of him? Alexander made a reckless decision, fake being in a coma. A calculated risk that would allow him to discover hidden truths among whispers, tears, or betrayals. Days passed, and what began as a power game became routine. Nurses who changed him without looking into his eyes, family members who made empty promises, doctors who conversed as if he were furniture. Everyone showed their true selves, and that proved him right, until one morning, everything changed. A new voice, soft, almost musical, entered the room with a sweetness he didn't recognize. She introduced herself with a sigh. "Hello, Alexander, I'm Grace. I'm going to take care of you." That was the first time he felt something different since arriving at the hospital. Not because of the content of the words, but because of the way they were said, as if she believed he still had a soul. And then, not knowing he could hear her, she began to talk to him. She talked to him while arranging his sheets, while applying cream to his hands, while closing the blinds so the sun wouldn't bother him. Sometimes, it was just details about her day. Other times, more intimate things. Secrets she hadn't said aloud, not even in front of the mirror, and he listened to everything. If this mystery has already captured you, and you want to discover what Alexander really heard, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single heartbeat of this story. Grace Morrison wasn't the type of woman who stopped to feel sorry for herself. Since she was 23, she had learned that pain doesn't ask permission, and that life sometimes insists on hitting where it hurts most. Her freshly ironed white uniform didn't reveal the sleepless nights, or the dark circles covered with makeup applied hastily in front of the mirror. But in her hands, firm, warm, constant, you could see the years of carrying more weight than she should. She lived in a small apartment in the Riverside district, with her younger sister Emma, 17, and their mother, who hadn't been the same since sadness anchored itself to her body. Their father had disappeared when Grace was still a child, leaving only debts and a letter written with cynicism. Since then, Grace had been mother, sister, and provider, sometimes all at once. Her day began before dawn, with the sound of the alarm clock and the smell of stale coffee. She prepared breakfast, checked Emma's medication, who was battling a degenerative disease that doctors still couldn't name with certainty, and rushed out to catch the first bus to St. Gabriel Hospital, where she had just been hired as a floor nurse. The work wasn't new to her, but this hospital was more sophisticated, quieter, and more distant. The smiles were formal, the hallways immaculate, but something in the air smelled of secrets, of closed doors that no one should touch. Grace wasn't easily impressed. She had cared for patients in their final breaths, held cold hands in rooms without flowers, and learned to speak to bodies that no longer responded. So when she was assigned to Alexander Whitmore, the coma patient in the private wing, she didn't receive him with fear or curiosity. She did it as she did everything in her life, with respect and without expectations. But one first look, at those eyelids closed so tightly, at that jaw tense, as if he were holding back a scream, was enough to feel something strange. Not fear, nor compassion, but intuition, as if that man wasn't as absent as they said. Even so, Grace didn't comment to anyone. Instead, she began talking to him, at first with short phrases, barely whispers of courtesy. Then, without knowing exactly why, she started confiding fragments of her day to him. It was easier to talk to someone who couldn't judge her, or at least, that's what she believed. And unknowingly, she was awakening something. Grace's third day at the hospital was different from the moment she started her shift. Alexander's room seemed colder than usual, as if the air refused to move. Outside it rained persistently, and the sound of water hitting the windows was almost hypnotic. She entered the room unhurried, as if routine had domesticated her. But upon seeing her patient's motionless face, something in her chest contracted. She didn't know what it was. "It's raining so hard today that I wanted to stay home, but I can't afford that luxury," she murmured, while placing a small sunflower in a glass of water. There was no time or money for flowers, but she had found this one fallen, on the edge of a trash can, almost intact. She thought it would be silly, but when she left it near the window, she felt the room change just a little, as if something opened up. Alexander heard her, not just the words, but the gesture. He felt the way she moved around the room, how she arranged things, as if dealing with a living presence, and not a sleeping body. For the first time since deciding to pretend, he wanted to move, to turn his head, to say "I'm here," but he didn't. She approached the bed, took his hand carefully, and began massaging his fingers, one by one, with lavender oil, a gesture learned from her years in palliative care. They say touch is the last thing to go, just in case. "Here I am," she said with a tired smile. "My sister has days like this too, when she doesn't respond, but I know she hears me." Alexander felt a shiver. Sister? What was she implying? For a second, he wanted to open his eyes and ask her, but he contained the impulse. Grace's voice broke slightly, when she added, "If you knew everything we keep quiet in front of those who sleep, maybe no one would ever dare to pretend again." That phrase, thrown into the air like someone throws a stone into a lake, pierced through him. He didn't know her story, nor her age, nor her beliefs. But that woman, who cared for him without knowing he could hear her, was planting something dangerous in his soul. Tenderness. And he wasn't prepared for that. That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. He replayed every word from Grace in his mind, every tone, every pause, every sigh, and, for the first time since arriving at the hospital, he felt fear, not about his plan, but because someone, a stranger, was achieving what no one else had been able to in years, touching him inside. The following days blurred between dim lights, curtains breathing with the wind, and the constant sound of the heart monitor. But every time Grace entered the room, the world seemed to come into focus. Alexander, from his feigned silence, awaited her arrival like someone waiting for relief they cannot ask for. She moved with the delicacy of someone who understands that the body is sacred, even in its stillness. She spoke to him naturally, sometimes telling small anecdotes, a patient who got confused about rooms, a child who gave her a drawing for no reason, and other times, letting truths escape that weighed more than exhaustion. Today Emma didn't want to get up. She told me she preferred to dream, rather than face another day with pills and pain. "Would you prefer to dream too, Alexander?" Grace's voice didn't tremble, but there was something in it that made him feel naked. Alexander forced himself not to react, though his fingers clenched inside. Emma, that name repeated every day, and with it, the image of a sister, a fragile teenager who existed beyond the hospital. It was as if Grace's pain wove invisible roots to the edge of his bed. When Dad left, Mom stopped talking. She didn't become mute, but she became absent. I was 13 and swore I wouldn't let everything fall apart, but there are days when I would like to simply disappear, just for a while. Silence. Only the hum of the breathing machine. Alexander felt a knot in his chest. Each of Grace's confessions was another crack in the wall that protected him. Why did she speak with such confidence? Was it because of his unconscious state, or was this her true face, one she didn't show to the world? "And you, have you ever spoken to someone you thought couldn't hear you? What did you say?" Leave it in the comments, if you dare. That night, Grace stayed a few extra minutes in the room. She didn't do anything. She didn't say anything. She just remained seated, next to the bed, breathing with her eyes closed. Alexander could feel her presence like a warm current, and then without warning, she whispered something barely audible. If you were awake, do you think you could forgive someone who risked everything out of fear? Alexander held his breath. That question wasn't for him. It was for someone from the past. But still, it touched him. Because unknowingly, Grace was talking about him too. Alexander Whitmore had always been a strategist. Someone who thought coldly, who measured consequences, who left no room for emotions when it came to power. That's why he had pretended. That's why he had become a spectator of his own life. But Grace was disarming him, without touching a single piece of the board. Every word she confided without knowing she was being heard, stayed engraved in him. He couldn't push them from his mind. He relived them at night, in the darkness of his closed eyelids, feeling how his chest tightened with each memory. It was no longer just a game to expose betrayals. He was no longer gathering information to protect himself. He was becoming vulnerable, and that terrified him. One afternoon, while she cleaned his lips with a damp gauze, his pulse quickened without him being able to avoid it. Grace noticed, looked at the monitor, raised an eyebrow and smiled sideways. "Did you have a bad dream?" she joked tenderly. He contained an internal laugh. It was absurd, but in that instant, he wanted to open his eyes. He wanted to look at her directly and tell her he was there, that he heard her, that he felt every touch of her fingers. But he didn't, because he didn't know how to explain his silence, because he didn't know if she would understand him. How does someone justify deciding to be a mute witness to others' pain? How does a man forgive himself for hiding behind his own cowardice? That day, Grace read him a poem. She had brought a folded book in her bag, an old and underlined one, with worn pages. She opened it without saying title or author, and began reading in a low voice. Not all who are silent rest. Some just wait for the exact moment to speak again. Alexander felt a pang in his chest. Had she chosen it for him, or for herself? In any case, he felt seen, exposed, as if those words had been written just for him, decades before. During the night, the thought wouldn't leave him alone. I'm trapped in my own game, and the more I listen to Grace, the less I want to keep pretending. But what would she do, if she knew the truth? Could she look at him with the same eyes if she discovered that all this time he had been a spy behind her confessions? Alexander wished, for the first time in years, not to be alone. And it was then that he began to imagine something impossible, that maybe, someday she would also want to stay, even after knowing everything. Room 314 was almost in darkness. It was late, almost time for the night shift change, and most of the private wing hallways were already silent. But Grace was still there, sitting on the edge of Alexander's bed, with her back slightly hunched, as if the weight of the day had defeated her. It had been an exhausting day. Emma had had a relapse. Another one. The crises were more frequent, longer, harder. This time she had been on the verge of respiratory collapse. Grace had run from the neighborhood hospital to hers, with trembling legs and a shattered soul. She didn't know how to keep supporting so many fronts at the same time. When she entered the room, she didn't speak, not at first. She just looked at Alexander's motionless face for a few seconds, as if she needed to find there something that would remind her that not everything was lost. Then, she sat down, took a breath, and began to speak. But this time, not with anecdotes or soft sighs. This time she spoke with the voice of someone who can no longer remain silent. Today I thought Emma was dying, and me with her. Alexander felt something compress inside his chest. The phrase was so naked, so raw, that for an instant he wished he could open his eyes just to hold hers. "Do you know what scares me most?" Grace continued. "Not seeing her die, but seeing her get tired of living. She's only 17, and she already carries more pain than many adults could bear." She fell silent. as if regretting having said too much. But then, as if driven by an invisible force, she continued, "Sometimes, when everyone sleeps, I also want to disappear, just for a few hours. Go somewhere where no one asks me for strength I no longer have, where I don't have to be the strong one always." She rested her forehead against the back of Alexander's hand, closing her eyes. Her breathing was deep, slow, as if she were emptying herself from within. "But then I come here, with you, and even though you don't speak, even though you don't move, I feel like you listen to me. Don't ask me why, I just feel it." Alexander closed his eyes tighter. Every word from Grace stuck to his bones. It was as if she were caressing parts of him he thought had been dead for years. When she left, with light steps and absent gaze, he was alone again. But this time, a tear escaped from his left eye, slow, silent, uncontrollable. It wasn't from sadness, it was for her, because now, he wasn't just faking a coma, he was faking not loving her. Alexander had never believed in romantic love. He saw it as a luxury for the naive, as a weakness that only those who hadn't been betrayed allowed themselves to fall into. For him, relationships had always been contracts disguised as emotions, agreements, tacit pacts, power balances. But since Grace began visiting him each day, that cold logic began to crack. He no longer awaited her visits with mere curiosity. He needed them. Like you need air after holding your breath too long. Listening to her, smelling the faint lavender scent of her hands, feeling the warmth of her presence, had become the only moment of the day that made him forget he was living a lie. One afternoon, she entered humming a soft melody. She wore her hair in a messy braid, and darker circles under her eyes than usual, but her smile remained intact. Alexander couldn't see her, but he felt her. He felt the difference in the room's energy. Every time she crossed the threshold, everything seemed to take on another color, even though he kept his eyes closed. "Today I dreamed of the ocean," she said while adjusting his sheet. "One of those places where the wind messes up your hair, and no one asks where you come from." She paused. "Do you have a place like that, Alexander? A place where life doesn't weigh on you?" He didn't have an answer. He had never allowed himself to dream of escaping. His world had always been surrounded by expectations, responsibilities, power struggles. But now he did want such a place, and he wanted to imagine it with her. During the following days, Grace began telling him small, intimate details, that as a child she collected keys without locks, that she cried at old movies, that she had once wanted to be a pianist, but never had a piano. Things no one had told him before. Things no one would think he, a businessman in a coma, was hearing. And in the midst of all that, Alexander found himself wanting absurd things, like seeing her sleep, or laugh, or simply staying next to her without having to pretend anything. Every gesture from Grace was engraved in him. The way she spoke to him like an old friend, the way she caressed his forehead as if that could chase away his nightmares. Alexander could no longer deny what he felt, not even to himself. He was in love, with a woman who didn't know who he was, with a woman who believed he wasn't there. The fragile calm that Alexander had built alongside Grace began to crack one seemingly ordinary morning. From his bed, he heard hurried steps in the hallway, broken whispers between nurses, tones that usually didn't filter through closed doors, but something that time felt different. There was tension in the air. Two voices stopped near his room. "They say they're going to make cuts in the private ward," one murmured. "They're starting with temporary contracts. We need to be prepared." Alexander remained motionless, as always, but inside, the impact was immediate. He knew Grace was new. He knew her contract wasn't permanent yet, and he understood, with a certainty that froze his blood, that she could disappear from one day to the next, that he could lose her, without ever having had her. That afternoon, Grace entered the room without her usual energy. She didn't smile. She didn't talk about Emma. She didn't even turn on the soft music that usually accompanied the routines. She walked to the bed in silence, placed a blanket over his feet with slow movements, and sat beside him, as if the weight of the day had settled on her shoulders. "Today they told me they might not renew my contract," she murmured, without preamble. "It's not official, but when you've lived with fear for years, you learn to anticipate the blow before it falls." Alexander felt his chest compress. It was as if oxygen became denser. That woman, who had become his only light, was about to be extinguished by a system that didn't see the value of the invisible. He wanted to move, say something, promise her he wouldn't let her go, but he couldn't. Not yet. Grace lowered her gaze, gathered the sheet with her hands and smoothed it unnecessarily. "I'm not worried about the money. I've learned to live with little. What hurts me is thinking I won't see you anymore, that I won't be able to finish telling you my story." She paused. Her eyes shone, but not from exhaustion. "I know you can't hear me, or that's what I tell myself, but with you, I feel like someone listens to me. I don't know how to explain it." And he did. With every cell of his body, Alexander listened, and suffered. That night, the silence in the room became unbearable. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the absence of her. And Alexander knew, with his heart beating wildly, that he was closer than ever to doing something that could change everything. Waking up, the room felt empty without her. Hours passed slowly, mechanically, meaninglessly. Alexander had heard other voices, other steps, even other laughter, but none was Grace's. And though he wouldn't admit it even in his most honest thoughts, the absence of her voice hurt him more than any injury from his accident. 2 days passed without her appearing. 2 eternities that forced him to face the invisible mirror of his cowardice. How long was he going to keep hiding? What was he waiting for? Another confession? A divine sign? Or was he simply running from himself? On the 3rd day, finally, the door opened and Grace entered. She was paler, with dimmed eyes. She wasn't wearing her usual uniform. She wore civilian clothes, sober, as if she no longer quite belonged to the place. "Today I just came to say goodbye," she murmured, sitting beside him. "They didn't renew my contract. It was quick, dry, no explanations. I suppose it was to be expected." Alexander felt everything inside him collapse. This was the last time, the last day, the last minute to choose between truth or silence. She took his hand with both of hers. "I don't know why it hurts so much to leave you. You never responded, never opened your eyes. But with you, I felt accompanied, as if my words didn't get lost in the air." Tears sprang from his eyes. This time they weren't isolated drops. They were torrents running down his cheeks without shame. And Grace saw them. She held her breath. She leaned in. "Alexander," he blinked. Once, twice. He tried to move his lips, but his throat only emitted a rough whisper, broken by contained emotion. "Don't leave." The world stopped. Grace stepped back a little, eyes wide as if she had seen a ghost. "Are you awake?" Alexander nodded slowly. He wanted to speak, explain everything, beg forgiveness, but he could only say, "I heard everything." She looked at him, motionless. Silence reigned again, but it was no longer comfortable. It was a minefield between them. A mixture of relief, confusion and betrayal floated in the air. If this moment touched your heart, if you also felt that lump in your throat, give us a like and stay with us until the end of this story. Grace stood up without saying another word. She walked to the door. She stopped, but didn't turn. Then she left, and Alexander remained there, with his eyes open for the first time, feeling more naked than ever. The rumor spread through the hospital corridors, like a spark ignited on dry gunpowder. The millionaire patient woke up, but behind the curiosity, amazement and clinical questions, there was a much deeper story that no one knew, only Grace. For 2 days, Alexander was subjected to exams, neurological tests, nervous smiles from doctors seeking logical explanations for the illogical, but he only thought about one thing: seeing her. She didn't appear, not a visit, not a word, until on the 3rd day, the door opened, and there was Grace. She wasn't the same. Her figure was still the same, but the brightness in her eyes had gone out. She wore her hair carelessly pulled back, her back straight like a wall, and an expression Alexander didn't recognize: disappointment. "So all this time you were awake?" Her voice didn't tremble. It was hard, precise, like a sentence. Alexander wanted to sit up, but his body still responded slowly. "It wasn't like that from the beginning. I wanted to see how they reacted, who was real. And you used me," she interrupted. "You used my words, my silences, my confessions, to entertain your paranoia. No, Grace. With you it was different. You gave me back something I didn't know I was missing." She laughed, but without joy. "And that justifies everything. Does that justify that you listened to how I broke day after day, believing I was alone?" Alexander lowered his gaze. "Everything you said touched me. I swear it did, but I was afraid. I didn't know how to get out of the lie without losing you." "Then not hiding would have been a good start," she said, taking a step closer. "I opened my heart to you, because I thought no one was listening. You were there, and you chose to stay silent." A long silence fell. "You know what's worst," she continued, "that I don't know if I fell in love with you, or with the idea that someone, even if they didn't respond, was listening to me with their soul." Alexander breathed deeply. "I never pretended with you. Never. I was just afraid of not deserving you." Grace swallowed. Her eyes shone with contained rage and nameless sadness. "I also heard things I didn't want to hear, Alexander, but I never lied." "You did." She approached, took his hand one last time, gently. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "And don't stay silent again when someone speaks to you with their heart." She turned. She walked to the door. This time, she didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. And Alexander felt the world crumbling, in absolute silence. The hospital was still full of life. Gurneys coming and going. Nurses crossing hallways. Phones that wouldn't stop ringing. Everything seemed to move normally. Everything, except Alexander. He remained motionless in his room, with open eyes but lost gaze, as if something inside him had stopped beating. Doctors spoke of miracle. Lawyers, of pending business. His brother arrived with papers, promises and urgencies. But Alexander didn't listen to anyone. Everything seemed distant, false, irrelevant. The only real thing was her absence. Grace didn't return. She left no notes. She didn't respond to contact attempts. She had disappeared like dreams disappear upon waking, without farewell, without explanation, and that hurt more than any physical wound. Alexander spent hours looking at the withered sunflower she had brought weeks earlier. It was still there, in a glass on the shelf, leaning to one side, as if it too had decided to give up. He watched it, and remembered every word Grace said, believing he couldn't hear her. Now, he would give anything to be that reliable silence again. During nights, he got up from bed, and walked through the hospital like a ghost. He passed by the room where their invisible gazes used to meet, through the hallways, where he first heard her voice humming, through the inner garden where they never got to walk together. Every corner had something of her, and every corner hurt him. One dawn, no longer knowing what to do with so much regret, he decided to look for her. He didn't care what the doctors said. He left with a coat over his pajamas, took a taxi and asked the driver to take him to the Riverside district. He only had one clue. Grace had mentioned a flower shop below her building. Upon arriving, he recognized the green awning, the beige curtain, the plants in a row at the entrance. He climbed the stairs slowly, with his heart pounding his chest like an unsteady drum. He knocked on the third-floor door, once, twice.
Silence.
"Grace," he said finally, resting his forehead against the wood, "I'm not coming to ask you for anything. Just, thank you, for talking to me when no one else did, for healing me without knowing it." On the other side, a shadow moved, but no one responded. Alexander stayed there for several minutes. Then, he went down the stairs in silence, and for the first time, he felt what it was like to lose something you never had, but loved as if it had been everything. The days that followed were slow. Alexander returned to the hospital, to comply with the last medical protocols, but his body was no longer what kept him there. It was his heart, the one that hurt, the one that didn't know how to forget. He went back to room 314. It was already empty, the bed made, without traces, without flowers, as if nothing had happened there, as if everything had been a dream, but he knew it wasn't, because in that room his truth had begun, and also his loss. Months later, Alexander was never the same again. He canceled businesses, resigned from contracts that didn't represent him, and returned to walking through the city like a common man, without assistants, without suits, without masks. One afternoon, without knowing why, he stopped in front of a small store, with a simple sign, Morrison Flowers. He didn't need to confirm anything. He knew it was hers. It was her last name. It was her way of healing the world, from the earth, from the roots. He entered. The aroma of lavender and moist earth enveloped him instantly. There were fresh sunflowers in a metal bucket, just like the one she had brought to his room. A young woman greeted him with a smile. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for Grace," he said with a soft voice. "I just want to return something she gave me without knowing." The young woman looked at him with surprise, then pointed toward the back of the store. "She's in the greenhouse." Alexander walked with an agitated heart. Upon pushing the glass door, he saw her crouched down, with her hands in the earth, delicately planting a row of white daisies. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She had dirt on her cheeks, and a serenity on her face he had never seen. She looked up, their gazes met. There were no words, just a held breath, a stopped second, and a tear that descended again, down Alexander's face. But this time, it wasn't from guilt, it was from relief. Grace straightened up slowly. She took a step toward him, then another. She didn't smile, but her eyes were no longer closed. They were open, like his. "I thought you wouldn't come back," she said finally. "I didn't know if I should," he replied. "But I didn't know how to continue, without saying thank you." Grace nodded. They made no promises. They didn't speak of the past. They just sat, side by side, next to the flower pots, with their hands brushing accidentally, letting silence say what words didn't yet know how to pronounce. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss more tales like this. Sometimes, love is born where you least expect it, and it blooms, even among wounds.